Okay, so today we're going deep on something pretty intense and thought-provoking.
Oh, yeah?
From Star Trek, Voyager.
You bet.
It's the episode Jetrel.
Okay.
And we're really going to dig into like the fallout from this massively destructive weapon. It's called the Metreon Cascade.
Okay.
And the whole situation just gets so incredibly tense when the guy who actually created the weapon ends up on the same starship as a survivor.
Yeah, this is one of those episodes that just gets right under your skin, you know? Like, all those uncomfortable questions start bubbling up.
Yeah.
What happens when the person who caused so much pain and, like, comes back and says, hey, I want to help?
Right.
Can you even begin to think about healing when the past is just right there staring you in the face?
Oh, absolutely.
It's like this collision of personal trauma and the ripple effects of science gone wrong.
Yeah, and you see that so clearly with Dr. Jetrel.
Right.
He's the Haakonian scientist who created this weapon.
Yeah, 15 years.
15 years.
Before this episode takes place.
He unleashes the Metreon Cascade on Rinax.
That's a Talaxian moon.
And it just wipes out over 300,000 Talaxian.
Yeah, including Neelix's entire family.
Devastating.
Totally.
And then he shows up on Voyager.
Talk about tension.
Seriously. And to make it even more complicated, Jetrel claims he's there to help.
Right. He says he's looking for Talaxians who might have this disease.
Metremia.
Yeah, caused by the Cascade from those Metreon isotopes left behind.
So it's like this awful choice.
Yeah, a potential cure offered by the very person responsible for the suffering.
Exactly.
It's a moral minefield.
So for this deep dive, we've got a really interesting collection of sources to work with.
Oh, yeah, this is good stuff.
We've got in-depth episode reviews that really analyze the characters and their motivations, detailed fan wiki summaries that lay out the plot, and even an article that compares this fictional weapon to the Hiroshima bombing.
Powerful stuff.
Really gets you thinking.
So what we want to do in this deep dive is really unpack this episode. Go beyond just the surface level. Really explore those moral dilemmas.
Yeah.
And delve into the science behind the Cascade.
As much as we can anyway, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's science fiction, so we're going to have to take some liberties.
Definitely.
But we also want to look at the impact on Neelix.
Yeah.
This is deeply personal for him.
It is.
So we're going to be looking at themes of responsibility, guilt, and the idea of redemption.
Okay, so let's start with the Cascade itself.
All right.
Like, how bad was the destruction?
Oh, it was catastrophic.
Yeah.
I mean, 300,000 Talaxians dead. That's just from the initial blast.
And then you've got the Metreon isotopes.
Yeah. They pose this long-term threat.
This Midrotemia.
Right.
And Neelix was right there in the middle of the rescue efforts.
Exposed to all of it.
So he could have this ticking time bomb inside him.
Potentially.
And what's really striking is that the Talaxians surrendered less than 24 hours after the attack.
It shows you just how powerful this weapon was.
It was a game changer.
Absolutely.
So then Jetrel shows up 15 years later.
Out of the blue.
Says he wants to study Metreon and find a cure.
Right.
But the sources we've got really dig into whether that's his real motivation.
Yeah, there's a lot more going on beneath the surface.
Like what?
Well, for one thing, the sources suggest he's eaten up with guilt.
Really?
Oh, yeah. His own wife even left him.
Wow.
She couldn't deal with the fact that the man she loved created this horrific weapon.
So maybe he's trying to make amends.
It's possible.
Like a twisted kind of repentance.
Maybe.
Some of the reviews we read were pretty harsh on Janeway and the crew.
Oh, yeah, for even entertaining Jetrel.
Yeah, like why would they welcome someone responsible for mass murder?
Especially if the Talaxians weren't the aggressors in the war.
Right. It makes you question Starfleet's principles.
It does.
But then there's Jetrel's side of the story.
Right. He tries to justify himself.
How?
Well, he claims that discovering the Cascade was inevitable.
Like scientifically inevitable.
Yeah, as if it was bound to happen.
Yeah. And that if he hadn't found it, someone else would have.
Exactly.
But that's a slippery slope, isn't it?
Totally. I mean, it's a classic way to try and deflect responsibility.
Yeah. And then he says something even more disturbing.
About the Haakonians.
Yeah, he implies that they weren't really concerned about the long-term effects of the Cascade.
Like the radiation.
Right.
And Metremia.
And they just wanted to show off its immediate power.
Like shock and awe.
Exactly. It's chilling.
It is a complete disregard for the suffering they were causing.
So all of this is happening while Neelix is dealing with his own trauma.
Of course.
He lost everything.
His whole family gone.
It's no wonder he has such a visceral reaction to Jetrel.
I mean, imagine being face to face with the person who destroyed your world.
There's a scene where he describes Going back to Rinax after the attack.
Oh, yeah, I remember that one.
It's so powerful.
Oh, raking.
He talks about the smell of burned flesh. The landscape still smoldering.
And those survivors.
Emerging from the dust.
Horribly burned.
Barely recognizable.
It's haunting.
And then there's that little girl.
Talaxian, who dies later.
It's just devastating.
And some people think Neelix's anger might be masking something else.
Like what?
Well, we find out later that he actually ran away from the war.
He deserted.
Yeah, so maybe he's carrying around his own guilt.
Interesting.
And his rage at Jetrel could be a way of deflecting that guilt.
So he's not just angry at Jetrel.
Maybe he's angry at himself, too.
That adds a whole other layer to their relationship.
It does.
And at the end of the episode, Neelix says, I forgive you.
Oh.
It's such a loaded moment.
Huge.
So many different ways to interpret it.
Right. Is it true forgiveness?
Like he's let go of all the pain and anger.
Or is it something else?
Like maybe he's just trying to give Jetrel some peace before he dies.
One of the reviews even suggested it was a gift Neelix was giving him.
Wow, a gift.
Even if Neelix didn't fully believe it himself.
Or maybe it's even more complicated than that.
Right, like maybe it's about Neelix coming to terms with his own past.
Finding a way to move forward.
It's really powerful how they leave it open to interpretation.
It is.
It really gets you thinking about the nature of forgiveness.
And then there's the whole question of scientific responsibility.
Right. Jetrel created this weapon.
Does that make him accountable for what happened?
He tries to argue that science is neutral.
Like it's just a tool.
Yeah, he sees himself as an objective researcher.
And blames the Haakonian military for weaponizing his discovery.
But a lot of the sources push back on that idea.
Like they're saying he can't just wash his hands of it.
Right. At some point, you have to take responsibility for the consequences of your actions.
Especially when those consequences are so devastating.
Exactly.
And the parallels to the atomic bomb are pretty clear.
Oh, yeah. This episode is often seen as an allegory for Hiroshima.
And the article we read really highlights J. Robert Oppenheimer.
The father of the atomic bomb.
There's even a line where Jetrel talks about a light brighter than 1,000 suns.
That's straight from Oppenheimer's description of the Trinity test. And the screenwriter actually based some of Jetrel's dialogue on Oppenheimer's real statements.
Like about the impact of his creation and the mixed feelings he had.
Yeah, it adds a whole other layer of meaning to the episode.
Makes it feel even more real.
Definitely.
But it's interesting that some of the show's creators didn't see it as a direct allegory.
Like they weren't necessarily trying to make a specific political statement.
Even though a lot of viewers interpret it that way.
It just shows how powerful these stories can be.
They can spark all kinds of different interpretations and discussions.
Even if the creators didn't intend it that way.
So getting back to the episode itself.
Okay.
Jetrel's reason for coming to Voyager.
To test Neelix for Metremia.
Turns out to be a lie.
Oh, yeah.
He had a completely different agenda.
He wanted to use Voyager's transporter to collect a sample of the Metreon cloud.
And then what?
To try and reconstitute the victims.
Seriously?
I know it sounds crazy.
It is crazy.
Like scientifically impossible.
But that was his plan.
Yeah, a last-ditch effort to undo what he had done.
And the big reveal is that it's not Neelix who has Metremia.
It's Jetrel.
The creator of the weapon becomes one of its victims.
Ironic.
Tragic.
And it makes Janeway's decision even more complex.
To let him go ahead with the experiment.
Yeah, I mean, she has her doubts.
Tuvok definitely objects.
He points out that it has no scientific basis.
Oh, she gives the go-ahead.
Why do you think?
Maybe she felt like Voyager had a responsibility to help.
Like a shared burden.
Or maybe she saw how desperately Jetrel and Neelix needed closure.
It's a tough call.
And, of course, the experiment fails.
Yeah, those reconstituted forms on the transporter pad.
They just fall apart.
Jetrel's attempt at resurrection doesn't work.
And he collapses.
His hope completely shattered.
It's heartbreaking.
Yeah.
And then Neelix says that line.
Maybe the Cascade was a punishment for all of us.
It's so profound.
He's trying to understand the bigger picture.
The cycle of violence that led to the Cascade.
But some of the listener feedback we got pointed out that it could be seen as insensitive.
Like blaming the victims for their own deaths.
Right, like somehow they deserved it.
It's a difficult line to walk.
It is.
And the episode ends with Neelix forgiving Jetrel.
It feels like they're trying to wrap things up neatly.
But one of the sources pointed out that it's a bit too simple.
Like, I'm not mad at you, I'm mad at myself, so I forgive you.
Yeah, it doesn't really capture the complexity of the situation.
The reality of loss and responsibility is so much messier than that.
So this deep dive into Jetrel has taken us through some really heavy stuff.
Oh yeah, mass destruction.
The ethics of science.
Guilt.
Forgiveness.
It's all there.
And we've seen how it impacts people on a personal level,
like Neelix and Jetrel,
but also on a larger scale.
the societal level.
By looking at all these different sources, we get a much deeper understanding of the episode.
Its connection to real-world events.
And the different ways people react to it.
It's a great example of how science fiction can tackle big questions.
In a way that feels relatable and engaging.
Absolutely.
So for our listeners who want to learn quickly but thoroughly,
we hope this deep dive has been helpful.
We've tried to provide a structured and insightful analysis.
And we've left you with some things to think about.
Like, how do we deal with the consequences of war?
Especially when those consequences are so devastating.
What does true accountability look like?
And does forgiveness have a role to play?
It's something we all need to grapple with.
Yeah, these are questions that stay with you long after the episode ends.
And that's what makes Jetrel such a powerful and thought-provoking story.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
See you next time.